John Wayne as Genghis Khan. John Wayne as Genghis Khan in The Conqueror, 1956, is one of Hollywood's most infamous miscasts. The rugged Western icon, known for his slow drawl and cowboy swagger, was dropped into the role of the Mongol warlord, and the result was nothing short of disastrous. Critics were baffled. His performance felt more like a gunslinger lost in the wrong century, with lines like "I am Temujin the Conqueror" landing with all the authenticity of a cattle rancher at a medieval banquet. The New York Times called the casting a startling misstep, and audiences weren't any kinder. The film flopped, cementing its place in history as a cautionary tale of star-driven miscasting. But the real tragedy wasn't just the performance, it was what happened behind the scenes. Filmed in St. George, Utah, roughly 150 miles from the Nevada test site, the production unknowingly placed its cast and crew in a potential danger zone. At the time, officials insisted radiation levels were safe, but years later, an unsettling trend emerged. Dozens of those involved, including Wayne, co-star Susan Hayward, and director Dick Powell, developed cancer. Some speculate that radioactive fallout contributed to their illnesses, though scientists remain divided. The eerie coincidence only added to the film's dark legacy. As for Wayne himself, while he rarely admitted to regrets, some sources claim he privately considered The Conqueror his worst mistake, a sentiment many critics would likely agree with. Marlon Brando as Sakini. Marlon Brando built his career on raw, unfiltered performances, but in 1956 he made a choice that hasn't aged well. The Tea House of the August Moon cast him as Sakini, a Japanese interpreter, a role that required extensive makeup, a heavy accent, and a performance that modern critics often call a caricature. At the time, some audiences found his charm undeniable, but others were baffled by the casting. Why would an actor so committed to authenticity take on such an exaggerated role? Some speculate the studio saw Brando as a guaranteed box office draw and pushed the decision despite concerns. Decades later, Brando himself admitted regret, calling it a mistake. The film was a hit, but his performance remains a glaring example of Hollywood's long history of casting white actors in non-white roles, decisions that, like this one, have not stood the test of time. Katharine Hepburn as Jade Tan. In 1944, Katharine Hepburn stepped into a role that would later be seen as one of her most glaring missteps. In Dragonseed, she portrayed Jade Tan, a Chinese woman, despite being a white actress of European descent. Hollywood had a long history of casting white actors in non-white roles, but even by the standards of the time, this choice raised eyebrows. To transform into Jade Tan, Hepburn was heavily made up with prosthetics and exaggerated eyeliner, a practice then referred to as racial impersonation. The New York Times called her performance earnest, but other critics were less forgiving. The Los Angeles Times noted that her portrayal felt strained, and while few openly questioned the casting in the 1940s, some did wonder why an actual Chinese actress wasn't chosen. Modern film historians now cite Dragonseed as a textbook example of Hollywood's erasure of Asian actors, a problem that persisted for decades. Rumors even swirl that some in the industry privately criticized the casting, but feared speaking out. While Hepburn was undeniably one of the most talented actresses of her era, Dragonseed remains a rare misstep in an otherwise legendary career, a stark reminder of Hollywood's deeply flawed past when it comes to representation. Charlton Heston as a Mexican detective. Picture this. It's the late 1950s and Charlton Heston, Hollywood's go-to for rugged heroic roles, is cast as Miguel Vargas, a Mexican narcotics officer in touch of evil. Even at the time, the choice raised eyebrows. Heston, a towering American star, was no more Mexican than the studio backlot, but that didn't stop Universal from slapping on a tan and calling it a day. He even attempted a Spanish accent, though let's just say it wasn't winning any awards for authenticity. Orson Welles, who directed and co-starred, reportedly didn't push back on the casting. In fact, some accounts suggest Heston was the reason Welles got the directing gig in the first place. According to Heston's memoirs, Universal had only hired Welles to act, but Heston mistakenly assumed he was also directing. When the studio realized their leading man was on board because of Welles, they handed him the reins. That twist of fate gave us one of the most visually stunning noirs ever made, but also one of Hollywood's most infamous casting missteps. Critics at the time were split. Some praised Heston's dedication, while others found his performance stiff and unconvincing. The New York Times review from 1958 didn't mince words, calling his portrayal unpersuasive, though it still lauded the film's technical brilliance. and decades later, the role remains a textbook example of Hollywood's long history of casting non-Latino actors in Latino roles. In a 2018 essay for The New Yorker, critic Richard Brody highlighted Heston's casting as a prime case of the industry's failure to provide major roles to Latino actors. Despite the controversy, Touch of Evil endures as a masterpiece. But Heston's Miguel Vargas? Let's just say time hasn't been kind to that particular casting choice. Mickey Rooney as Mr. Yunioshi. Mickey Rooney's portrayal of Mr. Yunioshi in Breakfast at Tiffany's, 1961, is one of Hollywood's most infamous missteps. At the time, it was played for laughs, an exaggerated, bumbling caricature. But even in the early 60s, some audiences found it cringe-worthy. Rooney, a white actor, donned heavy makeup, prosthetic teeth, and an over-the-top accent to play the Japanese landlord, a choice that aged about as well as warm milk. The New York Times review at the time largely sidestepped any critique of the role, but that doesn't mean it went unnoticed. Some Asian American advocacy groups, including the Japanese American Citizens League, later called out the performance as a damaging stereotype, reducing an entire ethnicity to a punchline. Decades later, Rooney addressed the backlash, though his response wavered. In some interviews, he defended the performance, claiming he was just following the director's vision, but in a 2008 interview, he expressed regret, saying he wouldn't have done it if he had known it would offend people. Whether that regret was genuine or just an attempt to smooth over controversy remains up for debate. Today, the role is held up as a textbook example of Hollywood's long history of racial insensitivity. Some modern screenings even include disclaimers acknowledging its problematic elements. And while Breakfast at Tiffany's remains a beloved classic, Mr. Yunioshi serves as an uncomfortable reminder of how far Hollywood has come, and how much further it still has to go. Jennifer Jones as Han Soo-yin. Jennifer Jones was a Hollywood powerhouse, but even her talent couldn't save her role in Love is a Many-Splendored Thing from controversy. Cast as Han Soo-yin, a character based on a real-life Chinese-Belgian author and physician, Jones underwent heavy makeup and styling to appear more authentic. But audiences weren't fooled. Her accent wavered, and the transformation felt artificial, highlighting Hollywood's habit of sidelining actors of color, even in roles that should have been theirs. Some critics at the time praised Jones's emotional depth, but others found her portrayal unconvincing. Decades later, the film remains a classic, but her casting is now a glaring example of the industry's long history of whitewashing. Laurence Olivier as Othello. Laurence Olivier was a titan of the stage, but his 1965 portrayal of Othello remains one of Hollywood's most controversial casting choices. In full blackface, with a deep brown complexion and exaggerated vocal inflections, Olivier's performance was met with discomfort, even at the time. The New York Times critiqued his mannerisms as unnatural, and other critics noted how his portrayal leaned into caricature. While his command of Shakespeare's language was undeniable, the casting choice felt out of step with the era, especially as the civil rights movement was reshaping American culture. Today, many film historians consider it one of the most misguided performances of the Golden Age. Some even speculate that Olivier exaggerated his mannerisms intentionally, as a way to distance himself from the role's problematic optics. But whether that's true remains up for debate. Paul Muni as Wong Lung. 1937. Hollywood was at its peak, churning out grand epics, and MGM was about to release The Good Earth, an adaptation of Pearl S. Buck's Pulitzer-winning novel. But the casting? A glaring misstep. The role of Wong Lung, a struggling Chinese farmer, went to Paul Muni, a talented actor, sure, but one who relied on makeup and eye tape to appear Asian. Back then, this wasn't unusual. White actors were frequently slotted into Asian roles, from Katharine Hepburn in Dragon Seed to Marlon Brando in The Tea House of the August Moon. But even in the 30s, some raised eyebrows. MGM had reportedly considered casting an actual Chinese actress, Anna May Wong, but not for the lead. Instead, she was briefly in the running for the role of Lotus, a secondary character. Ultimately, the part went to Austrian dancer Tilly Losch, and Wong, frustrated with Hollywood's casting biases, left for Europe. Why did MGM stick with white leads? Some speculate it was fear that American audiences wouldn't accept an all-Asian cast, but others argue it came down to star power. Muni was already an Academy Award-winning actor, and Louise Rayner, who played Olan, was a rising star. The studio bet on familiar names over authenticity. Despite the controversy, The Good Earth became a critical and commercial success, winning 2 Academy Awards. But today it stands as a stark reminder of Hollywood's exclusionary casting practices, a missed opportunity where an Asian actor could have brought true authenticity to a defining role. Louise Rayner as Olan. Louise Rayner's performance as Olan in The Good Earth, 1937, won her an Oscar, but not without controversy. Hollywood's long history of casting white actors in non-white roles meant that Rayner, a German-born actress, was transformed into a Chinese woman using makeup, wigs, and shading techniques. Some reports suggest that tape was used to adjust her eyelids, though definitive proof remains elusive. At the time, critics praised her as deeply moving, but modern audiences see it as a glaring example of Hollywood's exclusionary casting. Rayner herself later admitted she felt uneasy about the role, though the extent of her regret is debated. One widely cited quote has her saying, "I was always a little bit ashamed of it," but sourcing for this exact wording is murky. What is clear is that MGM never seriously considered casting a Chinese actress in the lead. While no direct memo confirms why, industry insiders at the time speculated that executives feared American audiences wouldn't accept an Asian lead in a major Hollywood production. Ironically, the film was intended as a serious, respectful adaptation of Pearl S. Buck's novel, but even in its attempt at authenticity, it reinforced the very barriers it sought to overcome. Alec Guinness as Prince Faisal. Alec Guinness was a master of transformation, whether as Fagin in Oliver Twist or Colonel Nicholson in The Bridge on the River Kwai. But one of his most debated roles? Prince Faisal in Lawrence of Arabia from 1962. At the time, few batted an eye at a British actor playing an Arab leader. Today, it's a glaring example of Hollywood's history of white actors taking on non-white roles. Guinness spent hours in the makeup chair, his skin darkened and his features altered with prosthetics to resemble the real-life Prince Faisal. Back then, this was standard practice. Now, it's a casting choice that hasn't aged well. The film itself was a massive success, winning 7 Academy Awards including Best Picture. But Guinness's portrayal? That's where opinions have shifted. Even Guinness himself seemed to have second thoughts later in life. In his autobiography, My Name Escapes Me, he reflected on certain roles with unease, though he never outright condemned his casting as Faisal. Some speculate he regretted it more than he let on, but there's no definitive proof. What's undeniable is that Lawrence of Arabia, while a cinematic masterpiece, remains a textbook case of Hollywood's historical blind spots when it comes to representation. Shirley MacLaine as Aouda. Shirley MacLaine as Aouda in Around the World in 80 Days, 1956, remains one of Hollywood's most baffling casting choices. A white American actress playing an Indian princess? Even back then, some critics raised eyebrows. The film itself was a massive spectacle, lavish, globe-trotting, and packed with A-list cameos. It even won Best Picture at the Academy Awards. But MacLaine's role? A glaring misstep. Instead of an authentic portrayal, audiences got dark makeup, a vaguely exotic accent, and a performance that felt more like a costume than a character. Some film historians argue that casting an actual Indian actress would have been a golden opportunity for representation, even by 1950s standards. But Hollywood had a habit of prioritizing star power over authenticity, and MacLaine was a rising name. Rumors swirl that the studio never even considered an Indian actress for the role, fearing a lesser-known face wouldn't sell tickets. Whether true or not, the decision aged poorly. MacLaine herself later admitted the casting was misguided. In a 2008 interview, she reflected, "I probably shouldn't have played Aouda, but back then you didn't question those things. And that's the golden age of Hollywood in a nutshell. Big, glamorous, and often blind to cultural nuance. Today, her portrayal is frequently cited as a textbook example of Hollywood's long history of whitewashing. The film may still dazzle with its spectacle, but MacLaine's Aouda? It stands out for all the wrong reasons." Tony Curtis as Antoninus. A grand Roman villa, marble columns gleaming, the air thick with rebellion, and then Tony Curtis in full toga, delivering the now infamous line, "Yonda lies the castle of my father," a thick Brooklyn accent in ancient Rome. When Spartacus hit theaters in 1960, it was an epic in every sense. Lavish sets, sweeping battles, and a heavyweight cast led by Kirk Douglas. But one performance stood out for all the wrong reasons. Tony Curtis's Antoninus, a runaway slave-turned-poet, was a casting choice that baffled critics and audiences alike. His unmistakable New York accent clashed so sharply with the film's serious tone that it became Hollywood legend. Curtis, born Bernard Schwartz in the Bronx, had built a career on charm, starring in hits like Sweet Smell of Success and Some Like It Hot. But historical epics weren't his strong suit. Universal Pictures insisted on casting him. He was a bankable star and his name would help sell tickets. Director Stanley Kubrick, who took over after Anthony Mann was fired, had little say in the matter. Some say Kubrick was less than thrilled with the decision, but the studio's word was final. Critics didn't hold back. The New York Times called his presence jarring, while Variety noted that his delivery made the film's serious moments unintentionally funny. Even Curtis later admitted he was miscast, struggling with the dialogue and feeling out of place among the more classically trained actors. To be fair, Curtis wasn't the only actor in Spartacus with an accent that didn't quite fit. Laurence Olivier's clipped British tones weren't exactly Roman either. But Olivier could sell it. Curtis, on the other hand, sounded like he should have been haggling over cannoli in Little Italy, not reciting poetry in the Roman Republic. Despite the criticism, Spartacus was a massive success, winning 4 Academy Awards and cementing itself as one of the greatest historical epics of all time. But Curtis's Antoninus remains a cautionary tale of Golden Age Hollywood's sometimes baffling casting choices. Proof that even in a masterpiece, the wrong voice can echo through history for all the wrong reasons. Hedy Lamarr as Tondelayo. Hedy Lamarr was the epitome of Golden Age Hollywood glamour, but her role in White Cargo from 1942, let's just say it hasn't aged like fine wine. She played Tondelayo, a character from a 1939 play, originally depicted as a Caribbean woman of ambiguous ethnicity. MGM, however, leaned into the exotic seductress trope, darkening Lamar's skin with makeup and giving her an accent that critics at the time found more distracting than convincing. The New York Times noted she was decorative but stiff, a sentiment echoed by other reviewers who felt she brought little depth to a character already mired in racial stereotypes. And modern audiences? They're even harsher, calling the role a textbook case of Hollywood's long history of sidelining actors of color in favor of bankable white stars. Yet controversy didn't hurt the box office. White Cargo was a hit, and MGM plastered Lamar's face across posters with the tagline, "I am Tondelayo," a marketing move that played up the film's exoticized fantasy. Some film historians speculate MGM may have deliberately courted controversy, knowing it would drive curiosity and ticket sales. Whether by accident or design, the film made money, but today it stands as a stark reminder of Hollywood's past missteps. Charlton Heston as El Cid. Charlton Heston was no stranger to playing towering historical figures, Moses Ben-Hur and later Michelangelo. But when he took on El Cid in 1961, critics weren't convinced. The film had all the makings of an epic, sweeping battles, lavish sets, and a legendary warrior at its core, but Heston's portrayal felt oddly detached. His signature stoicism, so effective in biblical dramas, made Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar seem more like a marble statue than a flesh-and-blood hero. Critics at the time noted that while Heston brought physical presence, his performance lacked the emotional depth needed to capture El Cid's complex legacy. The real-life Spanish warrior was both a ruthless fighter and a shrewd diplomat, navigating shifting allegiance with cunning. Heston, however, played him with the same unwavering intensity he brought to Moses, a choice that some felt flattened the character. One reviewer from the New York Times described his performance as noble but distant, a sentiment echoed in later retrospectives. Then there was the accent. Heston's unmistakably American cadence stood out in a film meant to transport audiences to medieval Spain. Historical dramas thrive on immersion, and hearing a Hollywood superstar deliver grand monologues in his signature drawl made it harder to believe in the world of the film. Some speculate that producers prioritized his box office appeal over authenticity, a common practice in Golden Age Hollywood where casting bankable stars often took precedence over historical accuracy. Interestingly, Heston himself later acknowledged that he took the role more for the film's grand scale than out of a deep connection to the character. Whether he was miscast or simply playing to his strengths, El Cid remains a visually stunning epic. But when it comes to embodying one of Spain's greatest warriors, Heston's performance remains one of Hollywood's more debated choices. Gene Simmons as Conchi. In Black Narcissus, 1947, Gene Simmons played Conchi, a young Indian woman, except Simmons wasn't Indian. She was a British actress, her skin darkened with makeup to fit the role. Back then, Hollywood had a habit of casting white actors in non-white roles, but today Conchi is often cited as a glaring example of the industry's history of misrepresentation. Simmons' performance was largely silent, Her character spoke little, relying on expressions and movement. Some critics at the time applauded her physicality, but others found the role one-dimensional, reinforcing stereotypes of exoticized, hypersexualized women. And the makeup? That choice hasn't aged well. Modern audiences recognize it as a textbook case of whitewashing. Despite this, Black Narcissus remains a cinematic masterpiece, praised for its psychological depth and stunning cinematography. But Simmons' role? That's where the film stumbles. Even director Michael Powell acknowledged challenges in casting non-white roles, though he never directly admitted regret about Conchi. Some film historians speculate that if the movie were made today, the role would have gone to an Indian actress. But in 1947, Hollywood wasn't there yet. Ironically, Simmons' career soared after this. She became a leading lady in classics like Spartacus and Guys and Dolls. But her portrayal of Conchi remains a stark reminder of Hollywood's long road toward authentic representation. Peter Lorre as Mr. Moto. It's 1937, and Peter Lorre, fresh off his chilling performance in M 6 years earlier, takes on the role of Mr. Moto, a cunning Japanese detective. But there's a glaring issue. Lorre isn't Japanese. He's Hungarian, buried under layers of makeup, prosthetics, and a forced accent. Audiences at the time flocked to theaters, turning the Mr. Moto series into a box office success. But critics were divided, with some uneasy about the industry's reliance on yellowface. Lorre himself reportedly had mixed feelings about the role. While he appreciated the steady work, rumors swirl that he grew frustrated with being typecast, especially as World War II shifted Hollywood's attitudes toward racial representation. By the late 1940s, he had distanced himself from Mr. Moto, never returning to the character. The Mr. Moto films weren't alone in this troubling trend. Warner Oland's, Charlie Chan, and Sidney Toller's continuation of the role followed the same formula. White actors playing Asian characters with exaggerated mannerisms. While Lorre's portrayal was more restrained than, say, Mickey Rooney's infamous turn as Mr. Yunioshi in Breakfast at Tiffany's, it still reinforced a Hollywood system that sidelined actual Asian actors. Today, the Mr. Moto films are largely remembered for this legacy, a stark reminder of an era when talent alone wasn't enough. Your race had to fit Hollywood's narrow mold too. Susan Hayward as Bortai. Susan Hayward was a force to be reckoned with, fiery, intense, and utterly convincing in roles that demanded grit. But in The Conqueror from 1956, even her talent couldn't salvage the disaster unfolding on screen. Cast as Bortai, the Mongolian wife of John Wayne's Genghis Khan, Hayward found herself in a role that defied both logic and historical accuracy. Critics didn't mince words. The New York Times dismissed the film as absurd, and while Hayward did her best with the material, she was undeniably out of place. Audiences weren't fooled either. Watching a red-haired, fair-skinned actress play an Asian noblewoman only added to the film's long list of missteps. And then there's the eerie aftermath. The Conqueror was filmed in Utah, downwind from a nuclear testing site, and years later an alarming number of cast and crew members, including Hayward, developed cancer. While no scientific study has definitively linked the filming location to these cases, the sheer number of diagnoses has fueled speculation for decades. Some even whisper that producer Howard Hughes, racked with guilt, spent years buying up every copy of the film to bury its cursed legacy. Whether or not that's true, one thing is certain. Hayward's role in The Conqueror remains one of the most infamous casting blunders of Hollywood's golden age. Boris Karloff as Dr. Fu Manchu. In 1932, Boris Karloff, riding high after his breakout role as Frankenstein's monster, took on a far more controversial character, Dr. Fu Manchu. The Mask of Fu Manchu was meant to be a thrilling adventure, but even in its day, it sparked outrage. Karloff, a British actor of Anglo-Irish descent, was buried under heavy prosthetics, his skin darkened, his features altered, turning him into Hollywood's vision of an Asian supervillain. Today, it's one of the most infamous examples of Hollywood's long history of racial misrepresentation. The film leaned hard into the yellow peril trope, portraying Fu Manchu as a sadistic, power-hungry mastermind bent on world domination. Some of the film's dialogue was so openly inflammatory that it drew backlash even in the early 1930s. The Chinese government reportedly protested its release, and some American critics called out its overtly xenophobic messaging. But MGM pressed forward, banking on audiences' appetite for exoticized villains and pulp fiction thrills. Karloff, known for his meticulous performances, brought his signature gravitas to the role, but no level of acting could redeem the film's deeply problematic foundation. modern film historians often cite The Mask of Fu Manchu as a textbook case of Hollywood's yellow-face era, when white actors routinely played Asian characters, reinforcing harmful stereotypes. The role of Fu Manchu was passed around Hollywood for decades, with Christopher Lee later donning the same offensive makeup in the 1960s. Today, The Mask of Fu Manchu is rarely screened outside of historical discussions about Hollywood's past mistakes. While Karloff's legacy as a horror icon remains intact, this role is a glaring stain, a reminder of an era when racist caricatures weren't just accepted, but actively promoted by the biggest studios in the world. Yul Brynner as Mongkut. Yul Brynner's portrayal of King Mongkut in The King and I was dazzling enough to win him an Academy Award in 1956, but in Thailand it was a full-blown scandal. The film was banned outright, with officials condemning its fictionalized, often comical depiction of a revered monarch. King Mongkut, a 19th century reformer who modernized Siam's education and legal systems, was reduced to a temperamental, almost buffoonish figure, a far cry from the scholarly ruler known for his diplomatic finesse. Thailand's strict lèse-majesté laws, which prohibit insults to the monarchy, made the film's theatrical liberties an unforgivable offense. Brynner himself, a Russian-born actor, became synonymous with the role, his shaved head and bronze skin turning into an iconic Hollywood image. But to critics, it was yet another glaring case of Hollywood's whitewashing problem. Some argue that casting an Asian actor could have brought authenticity to the role, but in the 1950s, studios prioritized bankable stars over cultural accuracy. Still, Brynner insisted his performance was meant as a tribute, not a caricature. Rumors swirl that the film's legacy was so controversial in Thailand that even private screenings were discouraged. While unverified, the notion underscores how deeply the film clashed with Thai cultural values. Decades later, The King and I remains banned in the country, a lasting rejection of Hollywood's version of their history. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our new videos each week. Thanks for watching.